Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which will equip you with creative, unique ways to secure hotel rooms and craft hotel contracts to fit the unique aspects of a crisis management booking and give you tools you can implement in your organization right away. I'm Dr. Ed Goldberg with the Association of Contingency Planners, and I'm always happy to work with the folks at ACP headquarters and Continuity Housing who make these webinars happen in such a professional manner. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please share them with me in the question box in your control panel throughout the presentation. And so the first question I'd ask everybody is, do you think the plan you have now is complete? Without a guaranteed housing component, it's not. In fact, unless your critical team has a guaranteed, and not to mention nearby HSSE vetted, pre-negotiated, pet-friendly, non-price gouging, the list goes on, a place to stay, they might not report for work, and your plan is really set up to fail. Enter Continuity Housing, founded in 2006, for just that reason. And even though they sponsor these ACP webinar series, today's session is not a commercial. Instead, it's essentially a lesson on how to do what Continuity Housing does, but doing it on your own. You'll learn the top 5 tips for negotiating hotel contracts, demystifying the trickiest contract terms, additional ways to give your organization first dibs on rooms at crisis time, and questions to include in your RFP. There's a lot of content, but don't worry, as we normally do, we'll send you a link to the recording of this presentation. With us today is Michelle Lowther, the founder of Continuity Housing. In 2005, after 15 years in various sales and operational management roles in the hotel industry, Michelle thought she'd seen it all. And then along came Hurricane Katrina, and she saw firsthand what it was like for people and businesses that were displaced by the storm. The following year, a New Orleans-based client's request to hold rooms at her hotel on a contingency basis led Michelle to leave the hotel industry and create what is now her proprietary program to contractually guarantee hotel rooms for her clients without having to buy them outright. Michelle's program has helped clients for the last 9 years over multiple activations, and it has a 100% success rate. In 2010, Michelle was hired to contract and manage the hotel housing for the Deepwater Horizon spill response in the Gulf. She led a team of 30-plus people to establish incident command center, help desk, and secure accommodations for thousands of individuals who were involved with the incident and restoration effort. Her team negotiated contracts with over 100 hotels in 9 cities, ultimately saving her client untold hours and millions of dollars. Michelle has over 25 years of experience. Her expertise in business continuity housing, conference planning, and hotel contracting have made her a sought-after resource and a popular speaker. She's based in Katy, Texas, and I'm thrilled that she's here with us today. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. Thanks for making this a priority today. I know everybody's time is valuable. I have a lot of content that I'd like to run through with you, but as Ed mentioned, this will all be recorded, is being recorded, I suppose, and will be made available via email later and then on our YouTube channel as well. So let's sit back and think of some good questions, and you can fire those away again, excuse me, in the questions area of your control panel. Okay, so when we think of housing, what will we actually get out of the session today? First, I just want to set the stage, and let you know some general concepts about the hotel industry, how they look at your piece of business, how you might approach them. Then we're going to get into a lot of specifics about actually negotiating the contracts. We're going to get pretty granular there with some terminology, and I'll go through that as quickly yet thoroughly as I can. But if you have any questions along the way, like I said, please shoot those over, or you can always feel free to email me afterward. We'll look, once we learn everything there is to know, right, about hotel contracts, we'll look at 2 different case studies. Those are a really good way to put these practices in perspective. My goal today is to really tell you how we do what we do and to enable you guys to use these tools in your own organizations. So the first case study we'll look at that'll kind of frame this up will be one of the top banks in the country. We will learn why their plan failed, And what they took away from that, this was in reaction to two large hurricanes in 2008 when they had a plan in place that they thought included housing, but it turned out not so much. And then, as Ed mentioned, we did all the housing for the Deepwater Horizon response from 2010 to 2014, and they did not have a plan for something of that scope, so we'll talk a little bit about what we did to assist them, you know, and really implement something that worked well. We did it very quickly. We were able to mobilize a large group of people, and I'll give you some details around that too. And then we'll talk about just some general best practices on how to set up a contingency arrangement with hotels that would be a good fit for your organization. So, unless your folks have a place to stay, your business can suffer, obviously. As Ed mentioned, they may not show up to work. Morale can suffer, especially if employees are separated from their families in order to come to work for you. And consequently, the rest of your plan can go out the window. So it's important that we include housing from the start. If anyone is in a position right now where you are identifying an alternate work site, I urge you to include some sort of research into the market, the hotel market, in that planning, and make sure that you vet the site with that in mind. So let's talk about contracts and just some broad overview concepts within a contract. The first is room nights, and all that means is the total number of nights that your organization will be spending at a hotel. So if you have 50 rooms for 5 nights, that's 250 room nights, and that constitutes the total volume, and that's something that the hotels consider when they're evaluating a piece of business. A room night for a hotel is a perishable good. And really, everything else that we say today is based on this premise. The fact that if I am a hotel and I've got 300 rooms, the fact that I have 25 go down empty tonight, that means I lose forever the chance to sell and make money on those 25 rooms for tonight. It goes away. So it becomes very interesting from the hotel standpoint when they are slotting in pieces of business and trying to determine what will be most profitable for their organization and their stakeholders. You know, sometimes if you call a hotel and you're told they're sold out, they may not be sold out. You know, it's a puzzle for them, and they have to piece everything together in the most profitable way that costs them the least. It's very interesting. There's a whole department built around that called revenue management. It's much like the airline fares as you see them fluctuating up and down. So a room night is a perishable good. Displacement means if they book your group, what other business might they have to turn away? That's something they consider as well. A walk is a reservation that gets bumped. Think in terms of flights again. You show up, you've got a confirmed reservation, excuse me, and you get to the airport and they've overbooked. Same idea at a hotel. There's a percentage of reservations at every hotel that don't come. We call that a guaranteed no-show. And you know, the person has put down a credit card, they've guaranteed the reservation, but they don't get there. They are going to overbook by X percentage or X number of rooms each night, in the hopes that, and under the assumption that, not everybody will show up, and they will achieve that perfect fill where every single room has a head and a bed and nobody gets walked. But that's what a walk is when you get bumped. Guaranteed no-shows we just reviewed. An early departure is just that. You know, you check in, you think you're going to stay 5 nights, you leave after 2. A lot of hotels want to assess an additional fee for that because that leaves them with 3 nights they thought would be sold, they thought would have revenue attached to them, and now you're leaving early, so there's no revenue, so they want to assess a fee. And we'll talk about that when we get into terms that I recommend you include in your contracts. Performance simply means, you know, how many rooms did you pick up versus, excuse me, how many rooms you reserved. So let's go back to our example of 50 rooms for 5 nights. And you book 250 total room nights. At the end of your stay, once your organization has departed, they're going to calculate how many rooms per night total you occupied and come up with a number. Maybe that number is 200. So your performance would be 200 out of the 250 total room nights that you booked. If you have any kind of history, you know, where you have had deployments before and you know that you usually consume 95% of what you contract, that's a really attractive piece of business to a hotel. If you don't have any history, it's a little bit riskier for a hotel. So they always want to get as clear and as accurate a picture of your performance and what they can expect in terms of revenue as possible. Reselling rooms, and that simply means if, you know, let's go back to our early departure, you had a reservation for 5 nights, you leave after 2, they want to be able to resell rooms for those last 3 nights. From your standpoint, in business continuity, you want to find hotels that can book last minute. You want to find hotels that in the event that you have to depart early, they're able to resell rooms that you ended up not using, and that means you don't have to pay for them. So that's the concept of reselling rooms. A room block audit simply means that you take a look at their records of who was in-house, who was in each room, and you compare that to your records, and you make sure that everybody was where you thought they were. And you make sure that the number of rooms that were reserved were actually held, things like that. But it's a good idea to do that every morning for the night before so that you have a nice clean record from a duty of care standpoint of where everybody is. It also makes the invoice reconciliation process at the end of a stay a whole lot cleaner. Direct billing is just an invoicing relationship between you and the hotel. And standardized contracts, we'll get into this more in just a moment, but that just means that you all will create a boilerplate after today, because you're going to know everything about hotel contracting. You'll create a boilerplate that you will then present to each property. The alternative would be you contact 5 properties, you get 5 different contracts, and you have to go through, it takes you 5 times as long, you know, to go through and vet in the terms and negotiate what you need. Whereas if you create your own boilerplate and you present it to the properties, you already know that your language has been vetted and you're very clear about terms, making sure that you're covered. Spreading your risk is very important, and we'll talk about that in more detail as well. But from our standpoint at Continuity Housing, we prefer to spread risk among multiple hotels. We think it's important for organizations to have more than one property in their pocket in a given destination, so that if any one hotel sells out, you have hotels 2, 3, and 4 to back that up. It's important not to put all your eggs in one basket. But from the hotel standpoint as well, it's also much more attractive for them because they are not getting too exposed. And this is strictly on contingency contracts where you're asking hotels to guarantee availability for you, and that's what we're focusing on today. This is not the case if you are, say, in the oil spill response. If you're reacting to something and you want to get as many people under as few roofs as possible, then this doesn't apply. But if you're negotiating a contingency situation in your destination market where your alternate work site is located, you want to spread your risk. And once again, just to put a nice fine point on it, a room night is a perishable good. So let's keep that in mind as we go through the rest of today's presentation. Your own contract is going to be the very most important thing that you can derive from today. And hopefully you're going to have a lot of tools to start putting something like that together. All right, so let's get more specific about the contracts and talk about some clauses that I consider absolutely necessary. The first one is the notion of first right of refusal. Now, this can be used in a lot of different ways. What we do is we set up, again, this is a contingency arrangement, so we go into a market, we do an extensive RFP process, and then, you know, we vet the hotels in, everybody's happy, we start the contracts, and we set up first right of refusal with each hotel. Now, if we need 100 rooms in a market, we're going to put more than that on hold. We're probably going to put more like 150 on first right of refusal. And what that means is the hotels cannot sell their last X number of rooms. Maybe that's 10, maybe it's 35. It just depends on lots and lots of variables. But they can't sell the number of rooms that they're guaranteeing for your organization without giving your company first option. So let's take winter weather. We're prepping clients right now for winter weather season. And we're going to go from, say, mid-October to mid-March. So for that period of time, they are guaranteeing that they won't sell their last 20 rooms, let's say, without giving our client the right to buy them first. So what does that look like? And how do you watch that? The challenge, I think, with this, from a hotel standpoint, is that hotels don't have a check-in and check-out date from us. So we have to really stay on them and monitor their compliance with this guarantee. But that's basically the promise. The promise is that they won't sell out without letting you buy them first. And that could be for any night in the entire 5 or 6 month period that they have contracted that for you. Once you're there, though, you can also use first right of refusal to extend your stay. So again, let's use winter weather as an example. You get there, you go in advance of the storm, and you don't know at the time that you're contracting with the hotel and telling them the length of stay that you need, you don't know necessarily how long you're going to be there. So you want to make sure you're covered, but you also don't want to put yourself financially on the line to guarantee revenue for any longer than you'll actually be there. So it's a guessing game. But you can use first right of refusal to extend the stay. So an example of the way that we use it is to say, okay, we're going to guarantee you 5 nights, but we have first right of refusal to book and continue the stay for an additional 14 nights. So if it's a larger scale event, that should cover you for at least the beginning period. For an additional 14 nights at the same rate, the same contract terms, the same concessions, and the same number of rooms and room types, all of that, as we are contracting here for 5 nights. Now, the benefit of that is you as an organization aren't guaranteeing them a bit of revenue for those 14 nights. However, you are still guaranteed the availability should you need it. I hope that makes sense. It's a great way to use first right of refusal. Another thing you want to put in there is the provision to negotiate a better rate or better concessions or terms should it turn into a very long-term stay. It's less expensive for a hotel to have a guest in a room stay for a long period of time. They look for long length of stay. It's less wear and tear on their asset. They don't have to turn it as often from a housekeeping standpoint. It's not likely to sit empty, because of that. So there's a lot less cost. If you are staying for an extended period of time, then it's costing them less, and you want a provision to be able to negotiate a little bit sweeter deal for them. And that could be your room rate, that could be some freebies that they might throw in, anything that you can think of, you can put in a contract. So that's a good clause to include. And there are no promises on behalf of the hotel, but it just opens up the conversation. No early departure. A moment ago, we defined early departure, remember, where you check out after 2 nights, but you were reserved for 5, and they want to slap a fee of, say, $150 on you. You don't want any early departure fees. In our minds, an unoccupied room is an unoccupied room. It doesn't matter if it's because you checked out early or because you never showed up. Or because we just didn't need it after all and we thought we did. It doesn't matter. All of that is covered by performance, which again is how many you occupied versus how many you booked in the first place. And there are damages and there are minimums that you need to meet in your performance clause. We'll get to that. But you don't want them to be able to hit you twice, where you pay for an early departure and then you might pay again in performance. So for the same reason, we don't want a separate charge for guaranteed no-shows. And that, you guys know from making your own reservations, you book a hotel room and they tell you if you don't cancel by X time, you're going to be charged for 1 night. That's being charged for a guaranteed no-show. So same reasoning, no charges a la carte for early departure or for GNS. Because attrition covers it all. Now, attrition in, say, the workforce is, as a workforce shrinks in size, the positions aren't filled. There's slippage. Same thing goes here. If you book 100 room nights, 20 rooms, 5 nights, you can negotiate a 20% typically attrition, meaning of those 100 room nights that you booked, you're only going to be financially responsible for picking up 80. They're going to let you slide on 20% of what you block. Now, the market right now is a lot more in the hotel's favor than it is in our favor, unfortunately. So they're looking more at 15% attrition or even 10% attrition in some cases. If you're booking last minute, sometimes they'll try to say no attrition. The industry standard, though, is 20. You're not going to be able to get in every market, but that's a good rule of thumb, is push for 20%, meaning you're only held to 80%. And any early departure or guaranteed no-shows, since it wasn't charged separately, that all gets calculated at the end of the stay as part of your overall performance. Cancellation means that you're canceling the full block. So you have signed a contract for a block of rooms for a certain number of nights and you cancel the whole thing. It's not canceling just one reservation. And that's a loss for the hotel, because once you are a definite booking for them, they start assuming that those rooms are gone and they stop selling, obviously, and they're going to turn away people that would want the same rooms. So in both of those cases, the hotel needs to be made whole. So if, for example, your attrition was 20%, you're held to 80% of your block, then make your cancellation 80% of the block too. If I cancel the whole thing, I'll still pay you for 80%. Now, let's go back to attrition. And let's just give a real-world example. So you have 100 room nights. Your attrition is 20%, so you're held to 80 room nights. You pick up 72. So you owe them for 8 room nights. At the end of the stay, you only picked up 72. So to make them whole per your contract, you've got to pay for 8. The thing is, you don't need to pay the full room rate. What you can negotiate is to pay them their lost profit. See, they have no cost. They didn't have an occupied room in those 8 cases, and there was no, wear and tear. There was no housekeeping. There was no front desk, energy cost, food and beverage, all that stuff. There wasn't any of that. And the typical margin for that is 75%. So you want to pay them 75% of the room rate to make them whole. You don't have to pay 25% because that's their operating cost. Okay, so on both attrition and cancellation, you only want to pay lost profit. That's what we call that. And the thing is with cancellation, the reason I put these together, cancellation, hotels will often put it in another part of the contract and say that if you cancel, you owe 100% of the room block at 100% of the rate. And our position when we negotiate is always cancellation should not make the hotel any more whole than attrition. So in both cases, at the end of the day, the most you should be paying them is 80% of the room block at 75% of the room rate. If you're not there for unoccupied rooms, okay? And if you do the math on that, that turns out to be 60% of what you block in the first place. Okay, billing instructions. You just want to be sure that you are very specific. If you have a master account and you set up direct billing, which I always recommend, you want to be very clear in your contract about exactly what goes to the master bill and exactly what must be paid by each individual. That's probably within your travel and your HR policies. The reason you want to set up direct billing, though, even if you plan to pay with a credit card at the end, is because that gives you some time. It requires the hotel to prepare an invoice and then to invoice you. Now, you can always pay that invoice by credit card, but it keeps them from charging your card very quickly upon departure, and then you guys having to go back and forth for any amounts in the invoice that might be wrong. So it gives you the opportunity to do your room block audits, to check the invoice against your records and make sure that everything's correct, and then give them the credit card. Indemnification. This is a big one, and if the contract comes from the hotel, not in all cases, certainly, but in a lot of cases, it is one-sided. So what you want to do in your boilerplate is to create some mutual language. I encourage you to create very fair, very favorable to all parties language in your contracts. If you present a contract to a hotel, it already raises their hairs a little bit on the back of their neck, but as long as the clauses are fair and reasonable, as opposed to being very one-sided for your organization, then we haven't had trouble getting those through. I think that it's a little more time-consuming on their end, but the basic ideas are all there. So make sure that indemnification not only exists there, but is mutual. There's a lot of turnover in hotels, and especially with regard to franchising. That franchising is a huge part of the business model in hotel ownership, and very few actual brand companies own much of their portfolios anymore. So you're dealing with a lot of parties. You've got the management company, you've got the ownership group, and you've got the brand representatives. Obviously, the management company and the ownership group, which may not be the same organization, have financial stakes in your contract, but those can change. And if you're contracting in advance, it can change between the time you contract and your arrival, or it can change during the term of a stay. You just never know. So you want to make sure that the terms of your contract will apply to all successors and assigns that may happen in the course of your relationship with a property. That's especially important because this kind of a contract where it's contingency based, this is not on their books anywhere. We have not, like I said before, we haven't given them a date that we're arriving and a date that we're departing. This is, hey, we just have a deal with you. This is, you are going to guarantee us available rooms. So it's a very different kind of contract, and if your contact person even leaves, which happens a lot in that industry, to advance your career, you move around a lot, you try different roles in different markets. If a contact person leaves, then you may be completely lost. There may not be anyone else on property that knows about your contract. So the communication, the relationships are very important, but protecting yourself contractually with this clause is equally important. And then you want to make sure you put some concessions in. I put a couple of examples here. The first is a comp policy, and what that means is, for every X number of rooms that you pay for, that you occupy, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50 or 75, you'll get one room night free. The trick with a comp policy is you want it to be calculated on a cumulative basis, not night by night. So let's say you have a 1 per 50 comp policy. So for every 50 paid rooms, you're going to get one free. And the first night, you have 45 rooms, and the second night, you have 80 rooms occupied. So on night 1, if you're calculating it on a nightly basis, you don't get a free room night, right? Because you only had 45, you didn't hit 50. And on the second night, what did I say? Did I say 80 rooms? 75 rooms? Let's say you had 75, then you'll hit it, and that's fine because you went over your 50 threshold. So you'll get one free room night there. If, however, you're calculating it cumulatively, you have 125 total room nights, which earns you 2 comps. Okay, so you just want to make sure the word cumulative is in there. There are all sorts of freebies you can ask for: parking, internet, breakfast vouchers, phone calls, any kind of extra, fitness center access, whatever is there. And a lot of these things are included, more and more, and especially for our purposes and in our industry, we're booking a lot of suite products that a full family can stay in. It has a little kitchenette, that type of hotel. So a lot of these things are thrown in, but maybe it's transportation, maybe it's a rebate back to you. I mean, there are all kinds of things. If you can think of it, you can put it in your contract. And that's another reason for really going through with your specific organization's purposes in mind. It's another reason to create your own boilerplate. Okay, so let's get into some specifics. Regarding length of stay, we talked about this originally as one of the qualifiers that a hotel uses to consider a piece of business. How long are you going to be there? Keeping in mind that they want long stays. They like long stays. But from your standpoint, again, you don't know how long you're going to be there in a recovery. So you want to include that first right of refusal to extend. And provisions to renegotiate, which we reviewed. When it comes to walks, there needs to be some sort of, we just call ours a no-walk policy, but there needs to be some sort of verbiage in your contract to protect you as much as you can against walks. At the end of the day, if the hotel is going to walk people, they're going to walk people. And it's a puzzle for them. It depends on what time people are arriving. They don't, for example, if your folks are coming in at 2 in the morning, they don't want to walk someone at 9 p.m. in the hope that your person's going to show up and then risk maybe having that room go empty and they've walked someone, you know, because it's bad PR. They have to pay for the walked person's stay at the alternate property, all sorts of things. But you want to put it in there that in as much as they can, they will walk other guests first. Usually that's not a problem to get through with the hotels because of the nature of this type of stay. And they're very sympathetic to that. If they still have to walk your guest, we want to make sure that they pay for all of these items, and more importantly, that they list that person's name with their phone operator who answers their switchboard, so that their family members who may have thought that was their hotel assignment will know their alternate location, and your staff. You know, you're not going to be up at 3 in the morning when they may be arriving at a hotel. You probably aren't going to ask them to text you at that time, and then the next day you want to be able to find everybody. You know, so from a duty of care standpoint and just knowing where your folks are, it's important that they list with PBX. And then regarding guaranteed no-shows, we don't let them charge a la carte, as we've said. We want to make sure that all unoccupied rooms are covered by the performance clause. And we put that specific phrase, just like it's written here, in our contracts. So there's no doubt that for guaranteed no-show or early departure rooms, they direct themselves to the performance portion of the contract to see how they're able to charge for damages. Same here, like I said, for early departures. With direct billing, as we mentioned, we want to make sure that you get that set up. It usually requires a pretty quick one-page credit app. If you have any hotel references in your arsenal, those are the way to get that pushed through the fastest. Those are the way to get that approved. But and that's always what they prefer. But either way, fill out the credit app and get it to the hotel, and then follow up with them because they can sit on those for a long time sometimes. And if you've got a contingency contract term coming up soon, you want to make sure that your billing is live as soon as your contract term is live. And we talked about that too. Attrition, again, you want to shoot for that 20%. They really are pushing to more like 15 or 10. Anything you can get, though, you need to calculate that when you're reserving your rooms. So if you know, for example, that you only have 10% slippage somewhere, you might want to reserve a little bit differently than if you have 20% slippage. You know, you can afford to reserve more if you've got a 20% give me than if you have only a 10. So you be mindful of that when you're deciding how many rooms a night you actually want to be bound to. Make sure your damages are based on lost profit, which once again is 75% of the contracted rate, and that goes for cancellation as well. Cancellation should not make the hotel any more whole than attrition. And I touched on that before. The comment that usually comes back from hotels is some version of, yeah, but, you know, and it's, yeah, but the guest wasn't here, so we lost the ancillary revenue. And ancillary revenue could be eating in their restaurant or buying their movies or parking or something like that. Those don't have a high profit margin. They have a very, very slim profit margin. The hotels make their money not on food and beverage, not even on catered food and beverage, which I know with the prices it seems like they would, but they don't. They make their money on the guest rooms. That's where the markup really is. And so that's where you want to focus. And if they're willing to accept the terms on attrition, you know, then why wouldn't they be willing to accept that on cancellation? If you had one person stay, then the rest of your group could be considered attrition, and they would be happy with 20% slippage and damages based on lost profit. So sometimes it's a conversation with them to bring them around, but the pat response, especially for those that are maybe newer in the industry, is always going to be 100%. And it's especially true now because the market is very much in the hotel's favor, excuse me, especially with regard to contingency agreements and, you know, starting to say a blanket no. Just a quick aside, one of the things that we always talk with our clients about is selling. I don't feel like we sell to our clients, but we have to sell our tails off to the hotels, and that's because This is not the normal way they do business. This is not in your comfort zone. So it's got to be, you really have to approach it from their standpoint and use this new vocabulary that hopefully you're getting today. Okay, so resold rooms. We talked about that a few minutes ago, where if you depart early or you don't use everything, they would like the opportunity to resell. Let's take that one step further. If they're able to resell, you don't have to pay for it, right? It doesn't mean that you pay and then they get paid again on that same room. It means that that's no longer, that one's off the table. So in your attrition clause, and I'll actually back that up, in your performance clause, which talks about how well did you actually do, and then how do you calculate damages if you didn't pick everything up, you want to include in there a provision that says any resold rooms, you will not be charged for. And so when you're defining the calculation and you're saying, okay, it's the full room block less 20%, less any resold room nights. And there you have it. It's that simple. And so if they're able to recover last minute, then that's less that you have to pay in damage. Now, resold rooms have to be calculated on the last room sold basis, which means if you have 15 empty rooms in your block and the hotel goes down with 20 empty rooms that night, they're going to assume that 15 of those 20 belong to you. So it doesn't mean that just because they sold 5 between the time that you cancel and the end of the night, you get credit for those 5. It means if they have your number of rooms empty, you still pay. Now, the flip side of that, your same 15 rooms were unoccupied. They only have 8 rooms that go empty at the end of the night. Now you're credited for 7. You also want to be sure that if they have any rooms that are out of order for maintenance reasons, for example, that those are not considered available for sale. So you have to say total number of rooms, less 20% slippage, less rooms resold, less rooms not available for sale. And then you're covered. Okay, your room block audits. Super important piece here of the whole thing. We used this in the spill response, the oil spill response, religiously, and it paid off huge for us. People are people, and when you assign them to a Hilton, they are going to show up in a Marriott, and it's for a variety of reasons. Maybe they get Marriott reward points. Maybe they think the Marriott is cheaper. They've gone online and they've been able to find one room. You were looking for 300, but they were able to find one, and they think they're going to save you money, not thinking that you're now paying for them at 2 places, potentially, at the Hilton and the Marriott. And they want to stay with a friend for carpooling. I mean, there are a million reasons. Because of that, it's really important to ask each hotel to report back to you each morning about who was in their property the night before. So you want names. You don't need room numbers, but you want names and you want number of rooms. And then that gives you a history of what's going on. It helps you from an HR standpoint. It also helps you in reconciling invoices at the end of the stay. And in that example with the Hilton and the Marriott, you could then contact the Hilton and let the room go for the rest of the time, right? So that's now an early departure, and that gives the Hilton an opportunity to resell, which hopefully would reduce your obligation for any damages. Another reason that you want to, you want to audit the room block is they could be miscoded. What that means is when you contract a block of rooms at a hotel, they create a special little code, and attached to that code are usually a room rate, but also billing instructions, the date that all these things are available, stuff like that. And they funnel inventory into that code that's made available just to your organization. But let's say somebody is coming with their family and they had a room with a king-size bed and it was coded correctly and all that, and they get to the front desk and all the front desk has is a room with 2 double beds. And your person prefers that anyway because they're there with their whole family, and so the front desk agent checks them into the room with 2 double beds, gives them the keys, off they go. They stayed in that room and they got the rate and all those things, but in some property management systems, that'll bump them out of the code because the room type changed. And you want to catch that and make sure it gets recoded and make sure that any miscoded rooms get credited to your overall performance. Excuse me, it's a little tedious, but it pays off at the end. And keeping that kind of running tally of where everybody is and what your costs are going to be will serve you well also. And then you want to check at the very end, after departure, you want to check to make sure your contractual terms have all been honored. So was the cost for parking, internet access, all those kinds of things correct? And were you given the complimentary room nights that you should have been given? Was it calculated on a cumulative basis, as you said, or did they calculate nightly by mistake, which might have cheated you out of a comp night or two? Things like that. Just make sure that all those terms have been honored. Okay, let's get into a couple of case studies, and I'll go through these pretty quickly because I know we're getting somewhat short on time, and I want to save a lot of time for questions. The first one, well, actually, sorry, let's back up. There are some things that these two organizations have in common. You know, one of them was reacting to hurricanes, the other was the oil spill. So you might think, okay, well, that's a completely different set of circumstances. But there were some pieces of common ground. The first is each of them thought they had a plan, and turned out not so much. These are very large companies, and the reason I even bring that part up is that, you know, these companies had a lot of leverage. They have travel departments, they have travel agencies that are dedicated to them. Those agencies are experts in what they do. They have hotel profiles and travel profiles built on the people that go on business travel all the time. The organizations had hotel relationships at the local and sometimes global level. They had, you know, just all sorts of reasons to think that they would be helped in a pinch, basically. Extensive hotel programs, that's referring to negotiated rates all over the place, where they would repeatedly travel for business, and strong relationships at the brand level. Obviously, they had a lot of spend, so they had a lot of leverage in the market. And here's what happened. In 2008, we had two back-to-back hurricanes, Gustav and Ike. This is one of the top banks in the country, and you know, I said this wouldn't be a commercial, but I would like to clarify, they were not our client at this time. They became our client in 2009, but what happened to them in 2008 was this. With a hurricane, with any weather event, you know, you get some advance warning. So even though they thought their travel management company was going to be the group to help them out, and they had everything in place, you know, they still gave themselves or had for themselves a few days to kind of prep and get things running. What they actually needed was 200 rooms. This organization moved responders and their full family. Sometimes one employee equaled 2 guest rooms instead of just 1. 200 rooms in their recovery cities. And what they would do is they would contact the travel department, and they would negotiate. That travel department would take it from there. So the people that became our clients were hopefully, you know, handing that process off. That was their thought. Okay, so here's what happened. It went really badly. They were still trying to get contracts done and get rooms reserved, and their folks were already on the road. So with a weather event like that, they're sending people out in advance of landfall, right? They want them to be up and running at the recovery site well before a hurricane hits. So, and you know, families are safe and all that good stuff. So what happened was they called the travel management company, and they just started getting on their computer and getting on the phone. But the problem was they didn't have relationships established with any kind of guarantee from the hotel. And if there's anybody on this call who does have housing, I think it's great that you do, who does have housing as part of your current plan, and you have relationships with hotels, I urge you to go through your documents and look for these words, based on availability. If that's in there, you don't have what you probably think you have, or what you might think you have. You need a guarantee. Based on availability doesn't help you, because you never know when they're going to have completely unrelated business that's already selling them out or getting them close to sold out. If a hurricane happens to hit, I'm in the Houston area, so if a hurricane happens to hit, you know, in Houston, when there is a Texas A&M or a University of Texas home football game in College Station or Austin, Texas, where a lot of Houston clients go to recover, forget it. And those home football games are during peak season, so you've got to work around that kind of stuff. So anyway, they were vying for the same rooms that everybody else was vying for. Now on the hotel side, I can tell you what happens because I've experienced it. For Katrina, we shut our system down. We were very concerned that we were going to fill very quickly and that those reservations may or may not be real. And what I mean by that is, they might reserve at our hotel, but 3 others along their route because they don't know how far they're going to get. They're sitting in contraflow traffic where there's a government-mandated evacuation, and maybe they're going to be here, maybe they're not. Now remember, from our standpoint, yes, we want to be good citizens, but we also do have a responsibility to our stakeholders, and we want to achieve that perfect 100% sell. And we can't do that unless we know a reservation is real. So we shut it down. No internet, no 1-800 number, no call the hotel directly and make a reservation, nothing. To get rooms at our hotel, you had to go through the sales department, which is where I was. Now, in sales, we then we're all competing, and saying, why my client is better than your client, and I want to get them in, and, some of that goes on. But we were very much in control of contract terms, the level of guarantee that client had to give us financially, and the size of room allotment that we were willing to give up to them. And hotels have to get their hands around that. So from your standpoint now, or actually let's use the case study. From this bank's standpoint, they were one of many, many, many phone calls asking for the same thing, and they had no relationship in place. So do you think it was easy for them to get rooms? No, it wasn't. They also had not really gathered the data that they would need as far as details on their employees to share with hotels. How many people are going to be traveling with you? How many beds do you need? Will you have a pet? The pet piece is huge. Do you have anyone with special needs that we need to be made aware of? All sorts of things. They didn't have any of that. So they were scrambling to get that together. Now look at it from that employee's perspective, who's going to have to hit the road and go to the alternate work site. That employee is boarding up their home, gathering their family, figuring out where their kids are going to go to school, picking up their elderly parents, whatever they're doing. They're probably not on your SharePoint site filling out a rooming list, So ask as they may, and not the travel management company's fault, but they couldn't get the data. Then the people got on the road and they couldn't communicate to them. I think we all know enough about that. The other challenge was, and this is true of most organizations I know of, and most that we work with, the travel department, it is your travel department, but that's an outsourced function. And that might be American Express Travel or Carlson Travel or Merit's Travel, one of the big agencies. That is, at the crisis response time, they're not your employee. So you can't tell them, I need you at 2 in the morning. And you can't, they do have an after-hours call number, but that's a general call center that handles hundreds of accounts. Those are not your dedicated agents. Those are not the people to be negotiating group contracts for you. So that was very challenging for them. And remember, my clients, my future clients, thought that this was a process that they would hand off to travel. They did not hand that off. Not at all. They were signing contracts on the fly, which means that they didn't get very good terms, for sure. It was very much in the hotel's court. Once they actually got a contract, they couldn't track down internally the person with the correct signing authority to get it executed. So in a couple of cases, here is this huge company, this huge name, all those things that were in their favor, but they couldn't get the person that needed to sign quickly enough. And in a couple of cases, they lost room blocks because they couldn't meet deadlines the hotels had placed on them in order to secure the block of rooms. So they had done all that work, they'd gotten the block, and then they lost it because the hotel had to move to the next customer. So they do all that, and they finally get everybody there, and they're ready to take a deep breath, but it was a little premature because once people got there were lots of other issues. Shuttle service was huge. The thought process was, Well, our employees and their family will probably deploy, they'll go out in one car, right? Whole family in one vehicle, and dog and cat and bird and whoever else. And they will get there and they will use the hotel shuttle to get them from the hotel to the work site. But you guys know that that shuttle is a van, and maybe there are two of them, but how many rooms are in that hotel? Is it 250, 400, somewhere in there? That's just not a viable way to get people to and from work with any kind of a guarantee. So that was very problematic for them. They ended up having to cater food, you know, at all hours. They created a hospitality suite for families because they were very distraught. There was just a lot of extra expense and no one to manage the details of this catering process that came up for them. And then there were people with dietary restrictions that they weren't aware of because they hadn't gathered all that detailed information, you know, up front. We called it a rooming list earlier. They didn't have any of that. Pets, that's probably all I need to say about that, but, you know, not every hotel accepts pets. Most make exceptions in a crisis response situation, but you've got to put that in your contract. The hotels sometimes will come to you and say, you know, I will only take a pet that is 20 pounds or less or 50 pounds or less. And my comeback is always, you know, I have a golden retriever who's perfectly lovely. He's 75 pounds, and he'd probably be a lot less disruptive than my sister's mini Chihuahua. You know, so you need to talk through all those things as you're talking about the contracts with the hotel partners that you select, but make sure that pets are covered. Typically, there is a charge that goes with that. It's usually a one-time fee, and you know, maybe it's $150. I've seen them as high as about $250, but it's per stay. It's not per night. It's an alternative to kenneling the pet, you know, which your employees' family would have to pay for anyway. And it's up to you and your organization whether you want to include that in covered expenses for them or not. But anyway, just be sure that that's in there. In this case, for the bank, people were showing up with pets and hotels didn't accept them and they were being turned away. So it was very bad. Then, as I mentioned before, just people being people, they were going from one hotel that they were assigned to another and not telling anybody about it. And then on the flip side of that, the company didn't have anyone to really own that process. So it's not just getting them there isn't enough. You've got to own the process. You've got to manage the group the entire time they're away in order to perform duty of care and in order to make sure your invoices are correct. So needless to say, invoices were not correct. They were an absolute nightmare, and what they ended up doing is taking 12 of their people. These were not the travel agents, okay? These were the people that thought they were handing off this process. 12 people full-time for 5 weeks. Each deployment was about a week. So they had 2 weeks actually away. They had a few days before, but the rest of it was all on the back end, about 2.5 weeks on the back end. Trying to clean it all up. So it was really a mess for them, a big learning experience for them. Another cost that they hadn't anticipated is standing up a hotel hotline because employees had all sorts of questions once they were on the road. A lot of that was you know, HR related and reimbursement policy and stuff like that, but also, you know, when can we get back and how long do we have to stay and is relief coming and those kinds of things. So you've got to have someone there to answer that, and it's very helpful. One of the things that we offer, that we do, is we put boots on the ground at a hotel. So if we've got people in 5 hotels, whichever hotel has the most people, we've got somebody there. It's a little more white glove, but it really helps, and it goes a long way toward morale. It goes a long way toward keeping the employees focused on the job at hand, which is why they're there in the first place, because their families are taken care of. Let's talk about the spend. They spent $3 million for 2 weeks away, and that's just the travel-related cost, okay? That's not the cost of the people, the work, and the soft cost of the work that they weren't doing for those 5 weeks. What that amounts to is over $1,000 per room per day. Absolutely ridiculous. So Let's move to number 2. So here now we have no advance warning. We have the big explosion. They didn't have a protocol in place for this specific event, but similar to the bank, they are a very large company. They have a large travel presence, a large amount of leverage, etc. But the problem was we were going into rural Gulf Coast locations for the most part, and we were creating this enormous spike in demand. So hotels all of a sudden had this windfall of business, and they were not exactly anxious to give us anything good in terms of contractual terms. We were competing with ourselves. So what did we do? Some best practices to come out of this, and this can be utilized, these can be utilized, on any scale event. It doesn't have to be something of this magnitude. But we contracted for short periods of time. So let's go back to the notions of early departure and performance and first right of refusal to extend your stay. We tried to marry all of those things together, and the best way that we could really minimize exposure for our client and for the hotels was to contract for, we might think we're going to be there for 6 months, but we're going to contract you for 30 days. And then we'll do first right of refusal for another 5 months. It kept our communication constant. We would just extend, by 30 days at a time. We would do an addendum to the contract, and that's all we had to do. We didn't have to recreate the wheel, but we worked with each other. The other thing we did for the hotels, because this was such a long stay in many cases, a lot of these properties were very, very small, kind of more your interstate type hotels, your highway hotels, Hamptons and Fairfields and Courtyards and things like that. And they needed the cash flow because we had most of their inventory. So we would reconcile and pay out the client's invoice sometimes every week in some cases, but usually twice a month, at least every 30 days, so that they could continue operating without being in the red. But it was very helpful to contract for short periods of time. Obviously, we had the provision to renegotiate the rates and terms, and we did that. And then we made something up. And earlier when I was talking about concessions, I said, if you can think of it, put it in your contract. Well, same thing here. We said, okay, this is our situation. We think we might be here for 90 days, but we really don't know. We're responding to lots of different pressures from lots of different sources, and we may have to up and go. So if that happens, we need a provision to get out of the contract without having to pay, out the nose in cancellation damages or attrition damages, excuse me. So we made up an early out clause, and the way that I use it now, that we use it now with our clients, we say 24 hours is our magic period. But it can be, in some cases with the spill, it was 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, whatever the hotel required. We want this amount of time to be as short as possible. But what it says is, we can give you X days notice, let's say 3 days, and with 3 days notice, you will release us from the rest of the contract till the end with no damages. So in a real world example, we could be contracted for 90 days, I stay 2 weeks, I give you 3 days notice, and then that's it. From day 4 to the end of 90 days, I don't owe you anything. They were willing to sign it because we were the demand at that time in a lot of these markets, and they understood that. And if we were pulling out, we were going to be last to go. And if we were pulling out, everybody was pulling out. So, they needed to be reasonable and fair, and you just have to work with them to strike that balance. But it saved millions of dollars. It was huge. I think we've talked enough about daily room block audits, and we did talk about the frequent invoicing. So there are some things that you want to make sure you consider. I'm just going to blow through these because these are probably things that you already think about when you're picking hotels. Things that you should also look at, though, are their pet policy, which we covered. You want to get some data on how full they usually are when you're most likely to need them. So if your primary risk is weather, since we've talked about that a lot today, then think of your season and ask them what's going on. You can also do some research in the market if they have a convention and visitors bureau. and find out if there are any citywide groups where a convention comes in and they're booking multiple hotels. It can be anything from a horse show to a high-tech, customer event. It can be anything. But they book a whole lot of hotels, and that's going to affect your availability if you need them. Their business mix is what kind of a hotel are they? You want a hotel that has more transient business, which is individual stays, versus group business, which is what you would be. You would be a group to them. Anything 10 or more is a group. If they have a transient mix, then that means they're booking more last minute, because groups are usually booked in advance. So they're more likely to be able to sell anything that you don't end up needing at the last minute. That comes into this next one, the transient booking window. You'd like to know how far out do they normally book. The more last minute, the better. You want to know what kind of bed types they have, depending on who you're sending. Is it just employee or is it employee plus family? Obviously, you want to capitalize on any relationships you already have, but if you're not looping travel or procurement into your conversation about this, I think you might be missing something there. Make sure you get your rate quoted from them up front. If they are hesitant to give you a flat rate, then get a range, so at least you have a ceiling. You also want to know who they consider their competitors, and if those hotels weren't on your radar, give them a call. But also, that lets them know that you're looking around. You want to choose the hotels that can resell for you the best. We've covered that, which means they book more last minute, and they have more transient business, and they have high occupancy during the period that you are likely to need them. Now, if they're a group house and they have high occupancy, that's not a good fit for us. We're not going to want that, because that means that they book way out in advance and they're still very full. You also want to make sure that you spread your risk for yourselves and for the hotels by using lots of small blocks across multiple hotels. You're going to have your one standard contract now after today. I know that. And you're going to make sure that your contract answers what if to everything you can think of as a possibility in a deployment. These things we've already talked about, so I'm going to skip through some of this. And in the end, the success of all of this is going to depend on your communication and the type of relationship, the strength of relationship that you're able to build locally at that specific property with the hotels. So last slide, I promised you 5 tips for negotiating with hotels. Your first tip is going to be to create your own master contract, your own boilerplate. Super important, and hopefully you've got a lot of tools you can use now and some verbiage to put in there. Make sure your terms are locked, including your room rate or a rate range in advance. Even if it's a contingency contract, have a boilerplate that you have agreed to, and all you're going to do is plug in, the dates or something, and then you're good to go. Lock as much as you can in advance. Understand where your real savings are, and then let the rest go so the hotel is getting something in a negotiation also. Remember that their primary profit center is the guest room. Ask for everything. If you can think of it, put it in the contract. All I can say is no. And then again, like we just said, if you can't answer all the what-if questions, then make sure you think about it some more and put something in your contract to cover you. Ed, that is all I have.
That's it?
That's it.
Well, that's easy. Everybody's been taking notes, and they're gonna go out and do this. There's nothing to it. So that was one of the things that I was having a sidebar with Fred, that this is something that you can tell everybody how to do it, but absent the experience, it's not so easy. So I guess you got to do it and do it and do it, and then maybe it'll kick in. So we have questions. There's more questions than we really have time for, but what I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, is we'll go through all the questions, and anybody that needs to drop off can drop off, and then they can listen to the recording. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Okay. First question is, what is the value proposition for the hotels? What can I tell them to make them think it's a good idea to guarantee available rooms?
Okay, so that's a really good question. Earlier I said that we joke internally in my company about where we sell, and we say that the selling happens with the hotels. And it is tough for them because this is not the normal way they do business. Like I said, it's very much out of their day-to-day ops. And most of the time when we call them, their answer is no. And it takes, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, for them to really hear the way that we do it and how it's different. The question that they get a lot, which is why probably someone asked this question about a value proposition, the question I get a lot is, can you hold something for me if something happens? Like, how do I know that you'll have something for me? Can you just do that? And the hotel says, yeah, you want to buy the rooms? And the company says, no, not so much, and then that's where the conversation stops. What we tell the hotels is there's value in having our clients in their hotel at the time, as opposed to not knowing who their reservations are and whether or not they're real. So I talked a little bit about the Houston experience I had during Katrina, and we shut everything down. They're going to do that too, and they'll know that the reservations are real. We're willing to sign a contract that guarantees certain things for them, and we have credit with them. So it's a corporate piece of business with a good solid length of stay and credit. They're not going to have individuals whose credit card may not go through and that kind of thing. So that's the way we usually approach it with them.
Well, that's a good way to do it. Makes sense. Can hotels kick people out in order to accommodate others?
Yes and no. So yes, they can. There are different laws in different states about this, and sometimes in a conversation with a hotel, a client will have called hotels and have been told that, oh, don't worry about it, we'll just kick other people out so that you can have the rooms. They can. Anybody can breach anything at any time if they want to, but why would they? And sometimes it's tenant law, sometimes it's innkeeper's law, and it varies from place to place, and I'm not an expert on that, but I will say it makes no sense for them to do it. And it's very unlikely that would actually come to pass, because the people that are in the hotel are probably people that give them business year-round anyway, and they're risking a lot to take you in.
Yeah, and the other piece is it's hard to just picture them doing that, to go
Right.
down and, like, if I'm in my room and I have nowhere else to stay, I'm not leaving. You can kick me out. I don't know how they do it, but anyway, that's great. Hotels we've called before have pretty stiff cancellation penalties. Any suggestions on how to avoid them?
I think that just putting everything under the umbrella of performance really helps, like we talked about, so the cancellation doesn't make the hotel any more whole than attrition does, and that'll take the stiffness right out, because you're going from 100% down to 80. Also, only paying them lost profit, 75% of the room rate on any damages. That will help a lot, and making sure that guaranteed no-shows and early departure and all those things are not included, that the cancellation is a kind of a standalone. There is one other thing that we include in our contract templates, which is a 24-hour out clause. And this, again, is something that we just created because of the unique nature of this type of a booking. But we have a 24-hour period once a contract is executed with a hotel. We have a 24-hour grace period where our client can back out of it, no damages. So in the event of weather, they can trigger, they can execute a contract because they think they're going to stay. The storm can take another path, because the forecast wasn't exact, and then we can get out of a contract. So it's very helpful.
Okay. Related question, for the cancellation payment, is it based on the total number of nights you're reserving or just the first night?
Total number of nights, and that is calculated on a cumulative basis. So they look at the total room nights that you've booked, and they calculate it based on that.
Okay, great. We have plans to use meeting space in the hotel that we use for housing our people. Should we be spreading that out across more than one hotel?
I hope the meeting space is not recovery space, and that's your work site. Let me address that first, just in case. So a meeting room is very precious to a property, and they don't have many of them. You know, guest rooms are a dime a dozen, and they can be a lot more flexible. They're a lot more nimble with those than they are with their meeting space. If you've got, you know, anywhere upwards of 25 people, I would say absolutely don't use a meeting room as your primary alternate workspace, because it's too unlikely that it won't be there for you. In too many cases, and it also depends on the kind of property. If you're going to a suite property like the Homewood Suites, the Residence Inn, you know, they only have a couple of small meeting rooms, so it's even less likely there. But at a bigger box that handles a lot of group business, you know, maybe your downtown hotels, airport hotels that are Hilton, Marriott, Sheraton, things like that, it's still too risky. The other thing is, when they are looking at displacement that we talked about, if they hold a meeting room empty for you and somebody wants a meeting room, then there are usually guest rooms to go with that. So what the hotel is having to turn away in order to hold a meeting room open for you is not only the meeting room, but all the associated food and beverage they would consume, the audio-visual they would consume, and all of the guest rooms they would consume. And they would expect you to probably pay that, you know, instead, so that they didn't lose revenue over that period, and it just doesn't make any sense. As far as spreading the risk, yes, I still would spread it across multiple hotels and try to get hotels as close to each other as possible, and maybe consider charter transportation like a bus or something that would run sort of like at a convention between properties.
Very good. That is the last question we have. Michelle, thank you. As we wrap up, I want to thank everybody for attending. If you would each please complete the survey that pops up in a moment. It really helps us provide more productive, instructive webinars. And it lets us know how we can keep your organization, if you let them know that on the survey, how continuity housing can help your organization by providing housing for your critical personnel when you need it most. For Michelle Lowther and the Association of Contingency Planners, I'm Ed Goldberg. Thanks again, and have a great week.